everybody. Tonight we are joined by Richard Jones, who specialises in everything Jack the Ripper. So tonight we're going to be chatting to him about the man himself, Jack the Ripper. So Richard, do you want to kind of summarise the Jack the Ripper story?
Indeed. Good evening, everybody. Well, the Jack the Ripper story is a very simple story, really. In the autumn of 1888, a series of murders took place in the East End of London, and several women were murdered. The ones we think were the crimes of Jack the Ripper are the canonical five, and they were five murders that began on August the 31st, 1888, with the murder of Mary Nichols, and ended on the 9th of November, 1888, with the murder of Mary Jane Kelly. So it's five murders over a period of around about 11 to 12 weeks. But the significance is that those murders impacted on society in a way that no murders had done before and no murders have done since. So in essence, that's the story of Jack the Ripper, but it's left us with history's greatest whodunit, because the killer was never caught. We don't know who he was. And so the story of Jack the Ripper is, who was he?
There was various suspects, wasn't there? But none of them were actually charged with it.
The police had lots of suspects. Suspects were pulled in left, right, and centre. Very early on in an investigation, there was a theory that it was someone called Leather Apron. It was then that one of the police came forward and said that, well, it's John Pizer. They arrested him. They took him into custody. They questioned him. He had cast iron alibis. He was released. And then throughout the investigation, more and more suspects were brought in on suspicion of having carried out the murders. The problem for us today is, although we know from the newspapers and from some police documents they had suspects, none of the evidence has survived. So we don't know why they suspected any particular suspect. And without that evidence, we really can't assess how viable one person is as a suspect for being Jack the Ripper.
All right. So all the information just kind of disappeared then?
It's disappeared in several ways. Some of it was taken away by police officers when they retired, because it was quite common in those days for police officers on retirement to write their memoirs. There was a great demand from the public for police memoirs. So detectives often used to take cases away with them when they retired, if it was a famous case, as Jack the Ripper was. Others were just destroyed, some by the bombing in the Second World War. Some were destroyed simply to make room. So a lot of documents probably were just burned because they were just clogging up space. And at the time, it wasn't seen as being a very important thing. The case was over. Whoever committed them was obviously long since dead. So they got rid of the case. It's only in recent years, really, that there's been this upsurge in interest in the Jack the Ripper crimes.
All right. So, as you said, there was five, the conical five, as they're called. So, do you think that the victims were planned, or do you think they were just random women that were in the wrong place at the wrong time?
This is the big problem that we have. Because we don't know who he is, it's impossible to say what his motive was, or if he knew the victims. My personal opinion is that he didn't know the victims. He was an opportunist killer. He encountered the victims out on the streets at night and went with them to places where there was no police patrols. They were in dark gateways or dark squares, the perfect location for him to carry out the crime and then melt away into the night. So I personally don't think he planned the killings. I think they were opportunist killings, and the women were just, as you say, in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Do you, in your opinion, was Mary Nichols the first victim, or?
Personally, I don't think she was. I think Martha Tabram was probably the first victim. The lady was murdered on in August 1888, early August, and she, I think, may well have been a learning curve for Jack the Ripper, or for the Whitechapel murderer, because basically what happened to her was she was stabbed 39 times from the throat to the lower abdomen, but she wasn't mutilated. She wasn't cut open. Her throat hadn't been cut. So many people say because her throat wasn't cut, she wasn't mutilated or disemboweled, then she wasn't a victim. But whoever did commit that murder certainly would have been covered in blood from the knife wounds. So that might have been his learning curve. And thereafter, he evolved a modus operandi, which was asphyxiating the victims before he commenced the mutilations, which wouldn't necessarily have covered him in blood. So I think she was probably the first victim. And we are actually dealing with 6 victims, although then it opens up a whole hornet's nest as to whether some of the other victims were actually victims of the same killer.
Because was there not 4 after Mary Kelly?
Yeah, there was prior to Martha Tabram and Mary Nichols, well, prior to Mary Nichols, you'd had Martha Tabram, and then in April 1888, you'd had Emma Smith murdered. And then after Mary Jeanette Kelly, you had several more murders. You had the murder of Rose Mylett in December 1888. You then had the murder of Alice Mackenzie in July 1889. Then there was she was unidentified, so we don't know who she was, but it became known as the Pinchin Street torso, where a torso was left in a railway arch in Pinchin Street, and that was September 1889. And then on Friday, the 13th of February, 1891, Frances Coles was murdered. So there are actually 11 Whitechapel murders victims, and only 5 of those are believed to be the victims of Jack the Ripper, although, as I say, I think it might have been 6.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a question. Shall I? I can see a question on the screen. Shall I answer? It's what's my opinion on the Goulston Street graffiti and the apron found in the same location? I think they're 2 different things. Firstly, I think the apron is an important clue because it was a portion of Catherine Eddowes' apron. She'd been murdered in Mitre Square, and the apron was found in a doorway in Goulston Street. Coincidentally, in that same doorway where the apron was, PC Alfred Long, who discovered the apron, he actually found a piece of a chalk graffito which read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." And the word Jews was spelled Juwes, which has been the source of all sorts of conspiracy theories ever since. Now, most officers who saw that graffito said it looked faded, as it had been there for some time. And it was when people think of graffiti, they think it's going to be like a spray can job that you see on the walls. But in fact, it was written very low down in a door jamb, and it was over 2 rows of brick. So it was quite small and it was faded. So I think the apron is the important clue. I think the graffito was already there, and it's just a complete coincidence. Whoever carried out the murder then dropped the apron in that same doorway.
There's Paul saying that everyone seems to agree he had some type of medical experience.
Now, that's an interesting thing, Nicole, whether or not there was a medical experience or medical knowledge demonstrated. At the inquest, this was an important question that kept getting asked. Doctors were asked, does he demonstrate medical knowledge? Some doctors said that he did. They disagreed on the extent of his medical knowledge. Many said that he didn't, that he had maybe the knowledge of a butcher or a horse slaughterer. You could say that they would say that, wouldn't they? Because they obviously wanted to take the suspicion away for the medical fraternity. Whether or not, then you come down to what sort of knowledge did he have? Was it an anatomical knowledge, that is, knowing where the organs were and able to locate them? Or was it surgical knowledge, the ability to reach the organs and cut the organs out? And of course, then that opens up that argument. Which sort of medical knowledge did he have? Personally, I think he might have had some medical knowledge. And it's interesting that you had a huge Eastern European immigrant community in the East End at the time. And a lot of that community were barbers. And a lot of, for example, Polish Ashkenazi or Polish Jews, when they trained as barbers, they were basically what were known as barber surgeons as well. So they might have had a basic anatomical knowledge and basic surgical knowledge. So it's a question, again, we can't answer the question because we don't know who he was. And so he can. But I have to say that a lot of some doctors said that he did have the knowledge. Some say he didn't demonstrate medical knowledge. But I think if you look at some of the murders, particularly Catherine Eddowes' murder in Mitre Square, she was murdered in a dark corner of the square. He took away a kidney and the uterus from a left kidney and the uterus from the body. To me, that does say whoever did that murder, the speed with which he did it in 15 minutes. He was demonstrating some knowledge of anatomy, but whether it was surgical knowledge or anatomical knowledge, that's where I'm not certain.
There's Mags, Myths and Legends. Do you think there could have been more than one killer?
Well, it's an interesting thing because, for example, when we get to the murder of Elizabeth Stride, now 12:45 on the morning that she was murdered, so this is 15 minutes before her body was discovered, a man named Israel Schwartz was walking down Berner Street, and he saw her. He was certain it was Elizabeth Stride later. He saw her standing in a gateway of what was called a place called Dutfield Yard. And there was a man walking ahead of him who suddenly grabbed her and tried to pull her into the street. And she resisted. He then spun her around and threw her to the ground and began to attack her. Now, Israel Schwartz thought he was witnessing a domestic argument and he didn't want to get involved. So he crossed the road to avoid the couple. And as he did so, there was a man standing on the other side of the road. And the man attacking the woman shouted across to the man the word Lipski, which was it was actually used as a derogatory term to the Jewish community in the area at the time. And Israel Schwartz then thought the man followed him. And that has suggested to some people that there might have been two, that there might have been an accomplice who kept a watch out at the time. So, yes, there could have been more than one killer. But then, of course, this then opens up that other hornet's nest. Was Elizabeth Stride a victim of Jack the Ripper, or was she just a victim of a random attack by somebody who knew? Because there were a lot of gangs in the area carrying out attacks as well. And then, of course, we come down to, were some of the later Whitechapel murders the work of the same murderer who murdered Elizabeth Stride? So it does open up this awful hornet's nest. So certainly on the Whitechapel murders, I think there was more than one killer. As for the Jack the Ripper murders, I'm not certain.
Mm-hmm. Obviously...
Sorry,
answer Abov's question first.
No. Also, what do you think eventually ended his killing spree? Because serial killers don't normally stop till court. Do you think he left the country? That's above paranormal. Ask that question.
Yeah.
Well, you're very, very correct on that one. That it's very rare for a serial killer just to stop killing and then think that one of four things happened to him. Either he died, it could have been by natural causes or by his own hand. He might have even been murdered himself. It was a very violent area. Another possibility is that he did go somewhere else. He left the country, maybe went to America. That's unlikely because it's unlikely that he would have gone somewhere else and continued killing, and they didn't make the connection. Because we do have murders in France in 1889. We have murders in Dominica, murders in America, murders in Spain, murders in Portugal, and every time, this is through the 1890s on into the early 20th century, every time this happened, we get the somebody saying, well, it's Jack the Ripper again. So they were always on the lookout. So that's unlikely that he went somewhere else and carried on killing. Another possibility is he lived with his family and they thought there was something not quite right about him, and he was put into an asylum and they didn't realize they had Jack the Ripper. Another possibility is that he was put into an asylum by the authorities, who didn't want to say they got Jack the Ripper, because if he'd gone into an asylum, they couldn't prosecute, so there wasn't going to be a trial. Another possibility is that he went to prison for another offense and they didn't realize they had him, or that the authorities did catch Jack the Ripper and didn't want to name who Jack the Ripper was.
Because it did just seem
possibilities there.
Sorry, Richard. It did just seem to stop, if I'm correct. Is that right?
They see, yeah. They suddenly stop with Mary. If you accept that Mary Kelly was the last victim of Jack the Ripper, then yes, the murders suddenly stopped. If you accept that the later killings, Rose Mylett, Alice Mackenzie, Pinchin Street Torso probably wasn't linked to that same spree. The Pinchin Street Torso was probably linked to another murder spree. For example, somebody put a torso, or they found the torso of a female in the foundations of New Scotland Yard, which was being built in 1888. There were also bits of body washing up in the River Thames throughout 1888, 1889. And then they found some parts of a body of a woman in a rubbish tip in, I think it was Middlesbrough. Not Middlesbrough, sorry. It was it's in the north of England anyway. And that's but the boat had actually come from London, and it was like disposing of London's East End garbage there, and they found some parts of a woman there. So the Pinchin Street Torso probably wasn't. Francis Coles, again, possibly that was carried out by the same person who murdered Elizabeth Stride. So again, it's difficult to sort of say. But if you accept that there were 5 victims and Mary Kelly was the last victim, then yes, the murders ended abruptly.
Bob Paranormal's got another question for you, if that's all right.
Yep.
No, 2 seconds.
It just disappeared. What are your opinions on Dr. Francis Tumblety? Fled back to the yes, sir. Tumblety is very interesting. Tumblety, he was arrested in November 1888, and he was then released on police bail, and he skipped bail and went back to America. And there's all sorts of stories about Tumblety. Tumblety was a very eccentric character. There's no doubt about it. It's often said on the internet that he hated women. That's never been proven. And in fact, when he was, a lot of people say that he disappeared into America, and then the murders started in America when Tumblety went back to America. In fact, that's not right. The police and the newspapers in America did know where Tumblety was. He was staying in a boarding house or a guest house in New York, and the Inspector Burns of the New York police had him under surveillance. And the newspaper journalists got to know about this, and Tumblety was then buttonholed by the newspapers constantly. Did you commit the Whitechapel murders? Is that what you're wanted for? Inspector Burns, interesting enough, was questioned by a journalist and said he won't be going back to London. He's not, the type of crime he's committed is not, well, effectively he said he can't be extradited back to London for the type of crime he's committed. He was probably picked up under they reformed in 1885. They brought in the reformed, I've forgotten the name of the act now, but basically it made gross indecency with other men a criminal offence. And as a consequence of that, he was probably picked up on that offence and then connected to the Jack the Ripper murders. And there's interesting, if you look into Tumblety, there's an interesting section where he gets accused of lots of things, and he sues several people, and then the newspaper's given the opportunity to defend himself. And he just keeps saying, I didn't do it. I was an American in London at the time, and people thought it was an American. So consequently, that's why I got suspected. But Tumblety's interesting. There's a chap called Mike Hawley who's done a lot of research. If you look Mike Hawley up, Hawley, on Google, I've interviewed him several times for blogs. And he's done a lot of it, and he's convinced that Tumblety was Jack the Ripper. Myself, I'm not so convinced. Whoever Jack the Ripper was, you have to remember the victims weren't suspicious of him. And at the height of the crime, when they knew be near this man, going with this man to dark corners or dark squares would be dangerous. I have to say, Jack the Ripper must have been absolutely charming, because they didn't feel threatened by him. They didn't feel that he was a threat. And of course, by the time they realised he was a threat, it was too late.
That leads me on to one of the questions I've got. Maggie's got a good question for you, but I want to ask you this first, Richard, if that's all right. Just when you're saying that none of the women were alarmed by him, were scared of him. Is there any chance Jack the Ripper could have been a woman? I mean, we've always had this image, Jack the Ripper is a man, and it's come into my head a couple of times. Maybe I watched too many documentaries, but what if it was actually a woman?
It's a theory that's been around for a long, long time. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, for example, he thought that the killer disguised himself as a woman, and that's how he was able to escape from the scenes of the crime. And then William Stewart in the 1930s came out with a book where he suggested that it was a woman, and it was a midwife abortionist, and the killings were actually bungled abortions, then made to look like murders to cover up what was going on. I do have to say that this type of crime is not the type of crime a woman carries out. That this type of violence, the degree of violence, what's done to those victims, it's very much a male type of crime. But then again, you had the Mary Piercy murder, Eleanor Piercy, when she murdered Phoebe Hogg and her baby up in Hampstead. And that was just I think it was next year, but it wasn't long after the Ripper murders. And Mary Piercy at the time, when she did that was a vicious, brutal murder. But it just seems that it was jealousy that lay behind that particular crime. That Mary Piercy was having, or Eleanor Piercy was having, an affair with Phoebe Hogg's husband Frank. But she certainly, if you look into the Mary Piercy or the Eleanor Piercy or Mary Piercy murder, it's a very, very brutal, gruesome murder. But it's not to the extent of the Ripper murders, where he cuts them open and mutilates them and goes off with bits of the body. So I do have to say, from what we know from serial killers since, a female serial killer doesn't tend to go for that to that extent to what this went. Yeah. It's very much a male-dominated type of serial killing.
It's just something that popped into my head, I thought, it's always been assumed he was a man.
Yeah. And the honest truth is, you have to say anything's possible. The one certainty about Jack the Ripper is nothing's certain.
That's it. Mag just got a question.
So Mags, Myths and Legends, is there any evidence left that hasn't been tested by modern scientific means? DNA, for example. None whatsoever. All the evidence has disappeared. The kidney that was sent to Mr. Lusk, that's long since gone, so we can't even judge whether it was the kidney. DNA on the stamps, on the letters, those letters have been handled by so many people that the DNA will have A, degraded, but B, it's been handled so many times it's been contaminated. There's the very famous case from recent years of the shawl, the Catherine Eddowes shawl that supposedly was tested, and it had the DNA of the DNA of one of Kosminski's matriarchal descendants. Kosminski didn't have any children himself, so it was a descendant from one of his sisters. This was then tested on a shawl, which was then compared to a DNA from one of Catherine Eddowes' descendants. We do know Catherine Eddowes' descendants, and supposedly at the time, 2014, it was said to be an exact match, that it proved Kosminski was the Ripper. Then it turned out that the decimal point had been put in. I don't understand the exact mathematics behind it, but the DNA had been put in the wrong place during the test, and so consequently, it could have been one of millions of people, not just one person. So it narrowed it down to a sort of, if you like, I want to say racial type, but that's not the right word. But it narrowed it down to a particular group, i.e., Eastern European, but not a particular person.
Thank you. Dobie has got one for you.
Okay.
It just disappeared again.
Jack the Ripper have been a regular visitor with the ladies of the night, and he may have built up their trust. Again, it's possible. It's possible, Dobby. That happened. I personally don't think that's the case. And of course, you introduce a really interesting point there that's come in recent years. In that there's a book out now called The Five that says that the majority of the victims weren't prostitutes, that they were either sleeping at the scenes of the crime when those crimes occurred. Personally, I've never liked the word prostitute to be used to the victims, because if they were prostitutes, they were prostituting because they'd fallen through the net. It was the way they had to survive. So I've always preferred the Victorian term for them, which is unfortunates, and they would go out. Personally, if he was a regular, then that would suggest why they would be so secure, feel so secure in his presence. But there's no proof of it, and personally, I think it was just the fact he was an opportunist killing. But again, as I say, we don't know, because we don't know who Jack the Ripper was. So it is possible that he might have built up their trust like that. And above paranormal, do you think the letters and body parts sent to the press were red herrings? Yeah, the letters, we have to differentiate here. The letters sent to the press the first one was the Dear Boss letter, which is the one signed Jack the Ripper, and that's the one that gave him the name. The body parts letter wasn't sent to the press. It was sent to Mr. George Lusk, who was the president of the Whitechapel, also known as the Mile End Vigilance Committee, and he got the piece of kidney that purported to come from Catherine Eddowes' body in the post. I personally think the Jack the Ripper letter was the work of a journalist. Whoever sent that letter knew to send it to a news agency. If you send it to a newspaper, it gets limited coverage. If you send it to a news agency, it goes on the wire and gets covered throughout the country or throughout the world as it transpired. And that's what made the name infamous, and that's what made the killings so memorable. That name, Jack the Ripper. The body part sent to Mr. Lusk, again, this was a kidney. It was examined by Dr. Openshaw, who was the pathological curator at the London hospital. He said that it was a human kidney, but he said he couldn't say whether it was male or female. The press then said he'd said it was almost certainly the kidney taken from Catherine Eddowes, and he went on record and said, "No, that's not what I said. I said that it was a human kidney, but it had been preserved in spirits of alcohol." The police then concluded that it was a joke by a medical student who could have got the kidney from the pathology department of a hospital, and the fact it had been preserved in spirits did suggest that. So I think both of them were red herrings.
Oh.
We're coming thick and fast tonight, Richard.
There we go. Shadows of the Moon wants to know, what are your thoughts on Jeff Mudgett's theory about HHOs being Jack the Ripper? Jeff Mudgett's fascinating. I made a TV program with Jeff that went down on the History Channel, and I took Jeff and the team around Whitechapel. We based ourselves at the 10 Bells. Personally, there was no proof. There's no proof that H.H. Holmes or Mudgett was in Whitechapel at the time of the Whitechapel killings. Jeff's convinced that he was and wants to prove that he was. I think the H.H. Holmes crimes are sufficient to have in your ancestry without having Jack the Ripper also in your ancestry. But no, he certainly believes it. He's certainly very dedicated to it. He certainly has done a lot of research on it. And it is possible. Personally, H.H. Holmes was at. There's no proof that Jack the Ripper. There's no evidence that Jack the Ripper was out for personal gain. H.H. Holmes was slightly different. That it was that there was an element of personal gain in what he carried and the murders he carried out at the Holmes Castle. So yeah, again, it's possible. I personally don't think that H.H. Holmes was Jack the Ripper.
Thank you for that. There's always been, obviously, there's one for, and I went for Mags.
They're coming in thick and fast. They really are.
I tell you, Mags Myths and Legends wants to know: have you ever seen any crimes that have taken place in other parts of the world that you think may have been perpetrated by the Ripper during your research? Yes. There's crimes all over the world. You get a sequence of crimes that take place in New York in 1889, 1890, murders of prostitutes in New York. There's crimes that take place in France throughout the 1890s. Lots of crimes pop up in the newspapers that could have been the work of Jack the Ripper, or they could have been imitations of Jack the Ripper. This again is the problem because we don't know. But yeah, there are crimes. There's crimes in France, and there's crimes that take place. And I'm trying to think of one of the. I've just forgotten the name of the lady who was murdered in New York. But she was murdered in a hotel room, and I do apologize. I've just completely forgotten her name. But she was murdered in a hotel room in New York, and she certainly did have hallmarks of the Jack the Ripper murders. It was Carrie. No, it's gone completely. So yes, there's lots of crime, and they continue into the early 20th century as well. So the murders do continue, and it's possible that the Ripper was carrying out those murders. It's also possible that they were imitations as well.
Okay.
That name will come to me later.
The murders all took place in Whitechapel. What's your thoughts on maybe, I think everybody assumed that Jack came from Whitechapel, the Whitechapel area. What's your thoughts on maybe that he used Whitechapel just as a basic kind of hunting ground and he maybe came from another part of the city?
Again, it's very possible. Personally, I do think because of that apron found in the doorway. Remember, I said the apron was an important clue, and the apron was found in the doorway in Goulston Street. Now, by the time he's taken that apron away, we know the apron was used to clean himself up. So, in other words, we know that he's trying to wipe incriminating bloodstains off his hands, and he's also wiped the blade of a knife on the apron as well to clean the knife up. He needs privacy, and that doorway, as it happened, was a recessed doorway where the light tricked him 11 o'clock at night. So he's obviously used that doorway to clean himself up, which means that he's now committed. And don't forget, this is the night of the double murder. So Elizabeth Stride was murdered, and her body was found at 1 o'clock in the morning. 45 minutes later, Catherine Edwards' body was found. The apron was found in the doorway in Goulston Street at 2:55 a.m. So just over an hour and 10 minutes after the body of Catherine Edwards had been found. To me, that suggests that he knows he's got two police forces on his trail, and it's too dangerous now for him to stay out. Whatever he is, what he needs to get to ground. And to me, that apron in the doorway suggests he hasn't gone to the west of London. Mitre Square's on the periphery of the city of London. It's on the eastern fringe. Had he come from the west end, he would have gone Aldgate Street. Not Aldgate Street, Leadenhall Street, Cornhill into the city. Had he come from the south of London, he'd have gone down Minories and then over London Bridge and into headed for London Bridge and over the south bank of the Thames. Had he come from the north of London, he might have gone that way. So he could have come from North London and gone that way, and then escaped along Commercial Street and off towards Shoreditch, and then into North London. But personally, I think it suggests that he was heading for somewhere close by in the East End of London, probably in the Evil Quarter Mile, which was a knot of streets off Commercial Street, Flower and Dean Street, Thrall Street, Dorset Street, George Street. He's probably heading for there. So I think that almost certainly proves he lived in that area. And criminal profilers since have also concluded he was probably lodging around Flower and Dean Street.
Right, thank you. That's just something that, popped into my head today. I was wondering.
Yep. Oh, above paranormal wants to know, do you believe that the Ripper had deteriorating mental health because of the savagery of his attacks became more frenzied with each killing? I don't think it was deteriorating mental health. I think he got more confident with each crime. So he's a serial killer like this doesn't just come onto the world stage and his modus operandi is completely intact. He evolves or they evolve. So you can see it if you take Martha Tabram as the first killer. The first victim, then it's a frenzied knife attack. She's stabbed 39 times from the throat to the abdomen. It's the same region that the Ripper would target on his later victims. Then you get Mary Nichols. She's cut open, so she's disemboweled, throat cut, she's disemboweled, cut open. Then Annie Chapman, that's when it starts to get a bit more brutal. She's cut open, her throat's cut. This time he takes a trophy. He takes the womb away. So the womb is taken away from Annie Chapman. Then you get Elizabeth Stride. It's probable that he was interrupted when he carried out that killing. He cut the throat, was about to commence the mutilations, and that's when Louis Deemschutz came into the yard with his pony and trap, and the pony shied. So he probably interrupted this crime, so the killer didn't get a chance to carry out that crime. And then he goes to the City of London where he meets Catherine Eddowes, and that's an escalation. He cuts her open, he cuts out the uterus and the kidney and goes off with both of those. He's also cut deep V's into the cheeks, V's into the eyelids. He's cut off the tip of one ear. He's cut the nose, cut through the nose, taken off the tip of the other ear, and then he's literally plunged his hands into the body. So that's getting quite frenzied. And then Mary Kelly, well, I'm sure people have seen the photograph of Mary Kelly. It's the only one of the victims photographed at the scene of the crime. It's a horrendous photograph, and she's been all but skinned down to the bone. But the difference there is he had time. She was the only one murdered indoors. All the others were murdered in the streets. So he could be interrupted at any moment. But with Mary Kelly, she had her own room, and she's murdered in her own room, and that gives the killer time. So he's got time there. It's possible after that his mental health then did completely deteriorate, and he had a breakdown or was put into an asylum because people realized he was the people he lived with, or somebody realized that he was insane or there was something wrong with him, and he was put into an asylum. That's a possibility. But I think basically you can see he's getting more confident with each one of those 5 victims. Of course, then that's why it's not believed the later victims were the same victims, because he's almost gone back to the start with just cutting throats. No real mutilations being carried out.
So that suggests that he was enjoying it as well, maybe some kind of gratification.
Yeah, I mean that was the input. That was the thing that puzzled people. That was one of the things that horrified people more than anything else. The women weren't robbed, and they weren't robbed because there was nothing to really rob them of. They didn't have that. I mean, 3 of the victims ended up murdered because they didn't have the money, 4pence, to pay for a lodging house. That's why they were murdered, because they couldn't stay in a lodging house that night. So they had nothing to steal. So robbery wasn't a motive. As far as could be told, they hadn't been raped. No intercourse hadn't taken place. So as far as could be told, that wasn't the motive. As far as the press could see, and as far as people could see, it was done purely for the satisfaction of carrying out the mutilations. That was the thrill. There was no motive, and that's what the thing that terrified people, but B, horrified people as well. And you get lots of reports in the newspapers. Well, why would somebody do this? There's no reason, and that's when they start talking. We've got a Jekyll and Hyde out there, or there's this, there's this beast out there. And that's why he's often referred to as the Beast of Whitechapel, or the Fiend of Whitechapel.
Another question from above.
Above Paramore wants to know, do you believe the initial 3 killings were practices to hone his skills in removing the uterus? Yeah. When you say the 3 killings, so we're talking Emma Smith, the first victim, she was murdered on Easter Tuesday. Well, she wasn't. She didn't die. She was attacked on Easter Tuesday, 1888, at the junction of Osborne Street and Wentworth Street. She survived the attack, and she went to the London hospital where she told the doctor, George Hazlitt, that she'd been attacked by a gang of youths. Now, it seems that she was probably the victim of a gang. There were lots of gangs in the area at the time operating extortion rackets amongst the prostitutes. So she was probably a victim of the local gang. So I don't think I think she can be ruled out completely. Martha Tabram stabbed 39 times. No attempt to mutilate or remove anything. So I think she can be ruled out. She was certainly a learning curve if she was a victim on his modus operandi. Mary Nichols was cut open, disemboweled, cut open, possibly a learning curve. Annie Chapman, she's the first one then who has her womb removed. So certainly the first two, I don't think Emma Smith and Martha Tabram were. Mary Nichols possibly, albeit it might have just been that once he cut Annie Chapman open, then he thought, I can do that a bit more. There's also the possibility that it wasn't him that removed the organs. There was actually a trade in organs at the time. When the bodies are found, they're taken to the mortuary. So anybody in the chain going from the murder site to the mortuary before the post-mortem was carried out, anybody could have got hold of the womb and sold it to somebody, because doctors were desperate to find wombs for medical research purposes. So it's also possible that it wasn't the murderer who took the organs away, that they were taken away some stage between the murder sites and getting to the mortuary.
There's a series, Richard, the Netflix series Whitechapel, the first, crime that they had, and it was a copycat of Jack the Ripper. And I went into, I don't know if you've seen it or not, I went into quite a bit of detail. How close have you... Start again. Have you seen it? Because if you've not seen it, there's no point in asking you.
I've seen it. Yeah.
How close was that to the actual, real events?
I mean, it did follow the story, so it got fairly close to the real events as they were. The problem with film, because people always say, "Oh, did you see Whitechapel? Did you see Johnny Depp's From Hell? How accurate was it?" And the point about that is they're drama, but they're not historical documentaries. So they're not setting out to present the facts. They're setting out to tell a story. I certainly think it did capture the mood. It certainly captured the mood, the mood of the area. Historic action. I mean, one thing that always gets me in the films, this crops up. I mean, it starts from the Michael Caine film onwards. When they present the Vigilance Committee, they present them as a vigilante committee. They're always ready to riot. They got the torches. They get out to hunt him. The Vigilance Committee was set up purely and simply to be just that, a vigilance committee, to patrol the streets, keep suspicious characters under surveillance, and then report them to the police. But most importantly, they were set up to badger the authorities to offer a reward, because the authorities point blank refused to offer a reward for information. And that's why George Lusk was targeted, to get that letter from hell with the kidney in it, because throughout early October he'd been writing to the Home Secretary Henry Matthews, and then he wrote to Queen Victoria in early October saying, you must offer a reward. And the newspapers reported on that, and consequently his name cropped up in the newspapers throughout the first 2 weeks. And then somebody thought it'd be a great joke to send him a letter. So he got that letter, or he got the box, which had the From Hell letter in it, and wrapped inside that was half a human kidney. So but he certainly wasn't a vigilante. He was set up to try and get something done, to get the killings ended.
Was there a lot of pressure from, let's say, Parliament on the police to catch him?
There wasn't a great deal of pressure. There wasn't a lot of pressure from Parliament to catch him on the police. Where the pressure came on the police was through the police commissioner at the time, Sir Charles Warren. Warren had come in. He'd become police commissioner in 1886. And at first, he was quite popular with the press, particularly with the radical press, because he was seen as a military man who was going to bring much needed discipline to the Metropolitan Police. But then in November 1889, November 1887, he'd overseen, it was called the Bloody Sunday riot, or Bloody Sunday in Trafalgar Square, where the homeless had been camping out in Trafalgar Square, and the Home Secretary had actually tasked Warren to actually stop it happening. And he'd actually sent police in on horseback, and this had led to really, well, as one person said, it looked like warfare, and it made Warren incredibly unpopular with the radical press. At the same time, you'd also had on Jubilee Day, 1887, a lady called Miss Maria Cass, who was a glover. She'd gone out shopping on Regent Street at 10 o'clock at night, and a police officer called Plessy Endicott arrested her for being a prostitute because she'd gone out shopping, and she was seen on Regent Street at 10 o'clock at night. And she ended up in court the next day, charged with prostitution. The magistrate dismissed her, but said, no, let me tell you, if you are respectable as you say you are, you don't go out at night. No respectable lady goes out on Regent Street at 10 o'clock at night. And this then led the Liberal Party of Parliament to start criticising the police for this thing. So Warren was getting this horrible, was not horrible, but he was coming under constant attack from the newspapers and from the Liberal section of Parliament. But where the pressure on the police was coming from was from the newspapers. The newspapers seized the opportunity and they started attacking the police constantly from September 1888. And as the murders progressed, particularly on the double murder, the press criticism of the police intensified. And so the police were up against it then, because the journalists were in the area trying to get information off the police. The police didn't want to share the information because they thought if we share the information, we'll tip off suspects that were onto them. So consequently, the police were under a lot of pressure. So it wasn't coming so much from Parliament, but it was certainly coming from the press and through the press to the public.
Yeah, because I think Sarah's got some more questions for you as well, Richard.
Yeah.
The chat's got some questions first. The chat's full of questions.
Okay.
Because he was disturbed with that murder as well, and so he had to go and carry out another one, basically, to sort of fulfill his, urge or craving, whatever kind of word you want to call it, I think.
Well, on the double murder, or?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. On the double murder, he's. I mean, the belief is that that because he'd been interrupted, he was in a frenzy, and that frenzy was then carried out on Catherine Eddowes, which escalated the crime. That's of course if you believe that her and Elizabeth Strider were murdered by the same person. There's a lot of debate now as to whether that was the case. So yeah, but no, it's always been said that he made up for his friends for being denied the satisfaction by the horrifically mutilating the body of Catherine Eddowes. And Gillian's got a question there. So no sexual contact happened with the Ripper victims. As far as could be told, as far as we can tell, there was no sexual contact. As I say, this was one thing that came up at several of the inquests, and the doctors at the inquests who carried out the postmortems said there was no evidence that any contact had taken place. It's difficult because we don't have the inquest records as such. So it's what we can glean from the newspapers. But as far as can be told, the motive wasn't sexual, and sexual contact hadn't taken place.
Feels Above Paranormal's got another question.
So Above Paranormal, do you think if he had continued, subsequent murders would have occurred indoors once he realised he had more time to do his work indoors? Maybe. This is a tricky one because it depends where he met his victims. So, for example, Mary Kelly had a room that she would have taken him back to. So that's okay. But of course, if he's an opportunist killing, it depends on the victim he chooses. So is the victim going to take him to a room, in which case, yes, he will have time, or is the victim going to take him to somewhere? And this is quite an important thing to remember about the Ripper. It wasn't the Ripper who chose the murder sites; it was the victims that chose the murder sites because they knew where to take someone to, where they weren't going to be interrupted, where they had privacy. Then they were the ones who took it, and in so doing, they would take him to a place where there would be no interruption. And inadvertently, and unbeknown to them until it was too late, they took him to a place where they could be murdered and not interrupt, and where he could carry out their murders and not be interrupted.
I never knew that one. That's quite strange.
So, in your opinion, how well did Inspector Aberline actually do?
Aberline did a first-class job. The point about the police at the time was that they were hampered. They didn't have, well, fingerprinting was around, but it wasn't an established part of police procedure. So they didn't no fingerprinting was done. Robert Anderson is another police. He was the highest ranking officer with direct responsibility for the case. He was the assistant commissioner, the head of the criminal investigation department. Now, as he pointed out, that for one killing to take place where the murderer leaves no clues behind is unusual. For a sequence to take place where the killer leaves no clue behind is unheard of. And yet this is what was happening. So the police had nothing to go on. They had no clues that were being found. There was no connection. I mean, this is an important thing with murder, is that probably in something like 90% of murder cases, there's a connection. The victim knows the murderer. And so the police would then look at, well, who had the motive? But there was no, so who had the opportunity and the motive? But the victims, as far as we can tell, didn't know the killer. It was an opportunist killing. And so even today, that type of killing is very difficult for the police to solve, because they, obviously today they'd have DNA profile, DNA testing, CCTV camera, fingerprinting. The police in 1880 had none of that. They also didn't understand crime scene investigation that well, certainly at first. And they went stomping all over the crime scenes. And you can actually see with the bodies, Mary Nichols' body was removed from the scene within an hour of the body being discovered, and the scene was washed down of any. So any goodness knows what clues could have been lost at that time. So what the police looked for was witnesses, and so the only thing they could do was hope that they get a witness, or somebody would come forward and say, my husband's a bit weird, I think he might be Jack, or my dad's a bit weird, he might be Jack the Ripper. Because the other thing was to flood the area with police officers and detectives, which is what they did, and hope the next time he carried out a killing there'd be a police officer around to catch him. But that didn't happen, so consequently Jack the Ripper got away. But the investigation, Aberline brought himself to the verge of a nervous exhaustion, nervous breakdown, because he was out night after night on the streets. I mean, the police took it, it's often said, which is unfairly said, that the police didn't respect the victims, and they did respect the victims. And for example, I think it was Inspector Henry Moore, the Pinchin Street torso, although she was never identified, so they didn't know who it was. And the body didn't have a head; it was just a torso. She was sealed in a sealed container in spirits, so that she could be dug up, or the body could be dug up if they got any further clues. And I think it was Inspector Moore, but the lead police officer escorted her from the mortuary to the burial spot, and he stood there and paid final respects to her at the graveside. So the police did take it seriously, and Aberline really did take it personally. And I think he carried out a first-rate, and the other officers carried out a first-rate investigation. But there were no clues. There was nothing to go on, and that's why the Ripper got away.
Is there any chance that the Ripper could actually have been a police officer?
That's been suggested numerous times as well. There was a police officer very early on called Sergeant William Thick. When the police began interviewing the prostitutes of the area in the Evil Quarter Mile, which is where the early victims had come from, they were all lodged in the Evil Quarter Mile. The prostitutes began talking about this character called Leather Apron, who'd been running an extortion racket amongst them. And Sergeant Thick then came forward and said, well, everyone knows who Leather Apron is. It's John Pizer. Now, then somebody actually wrote to the police and said, well, no, everyone, it's obvious who the killer is. It's Sergeant Thick. So he got nicknamed. But since then, lots of people have said, yeah, the police officer could have carried out the murders. He would have known when the police were coming around. He would have known when the beats were taking place. So again, it's a possibility. And you can never say it's impossible, because we don't know who he was.
And exactly, just my opinion, if he was a police officer, that would maybe explain why the victims went so willingly with him.
Yeah, yes maybe. And no. The victims had an interesting relationship with the police. The police's job was to move them on, but the police seemed to have turned a blind eye to prostitution. I think the victims would have been, if a police officer had asked them to go with him, the victims might well have been suspicious, Because they might have thought, well, maybe he wants to arrest me or entrap me, and B, that he might be after a freebie, which is again another possibility. So
there was one popped up and it's disappeared again. Vale was asking, do you think H.H. Holmes was the Ripper?
Again, personally, I don't think he was, but there's Jeff certainly is 100% convinced that he was. So. Mag Smith, was it an unusual occurrence for ladies of the night being killed in the Ripper times? Do you know? It was quite common for them to be attacked, and there were murders of prostitutes by clients. Mostly clients did it because it was quite common for the ladies of the night to try and bulk the customer. In other words, try and rob the customers. So it was, for example, a favourite thing was I think it was called clipping, where they'd sort of say, you know, give me the money now, and then go and wait in that room, and I'll be in half an hour. And so the client would go and wait in the room, and then nobody would turn up, and so this was quite common. Another interesting thing was it was quite common for ladies of the night at the height of the Ripper scare to actually try and blackmail clients and say, look, if you don't give me extra money, I'm going to start screaming and say you're Jack the Ripper, and you pulled a knife on me. And it's quite a lot of people did carry knives with them at the time as well. A lot of men had knives, pocket knives on them. So yeah, it was quite common for women to be attacked by clients, sometimes murdered by clients as well. And there's lots of press reports of women, especially around Limehouse, Shadwell, the Docklands area, when a lot of sailors came along. But then also you had a lot of, again, this comes to the difference between the prostitutes as well. Some were street prostitutes who would go with men to dark corners. Others were what are known as sailors' women, whereby when a sailor came ashore, they would act as his wife for the few days or few weeks that the sailor was furloughed. So i.e. on shore with pay. It's obviously got a whole new meaning now, furloughed. But at the time, sailors put ashore were furloughed. And it was quite common for them, certain women, to be sailors' women, and they would have like sailors who they would be wives to during their time ashore. So yeah. But attacks on women of the night were quite common. Through the Veil, apparently. Through the Veil South, where the murder stopped when he went home. This is the problem. You see, we don't know that H.H. Holmes was in London at the time. We know there were Americans in London at the time, but we don't know. It's never been proved, and it's never been ascertained for certain that H.H. Holmes was in London.
So there's rumours that there's a connection between a guy called Spring-Heeled Jack who was around in that area in 1837. And that's how Jack the Ripper got his name.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, Jack was quite a popular name. It was you had sailors were known as it was used to describe sailors. It was also used, as I say, as you say, Spring-Heeled Jack, and it was quite a common name. You'd had like criminals like Jack Sheppard, who were part of criminal folklore. And you'd also had the fact that remember John Pizer, who Sergeant Thick said was Leather Apron, he was also known as Jack Pizer as well. So the Jack bit could have come. As I say, we think it was a journalist who wrote the letter anyway. But Jack was quite a common name used with Jack Sheppard, Spring-Heeled Jack. So it was already in circulation. And probably whoever just thought, someone was sitting there thinking, what name can I do? Oh, Jack the Ripper. What they probably didn't realise was the impact it was going to have, because what it did do was spark off a national pastime. And within days, hoaxers all over the country were reaching for their pens. And by the end of October, in the region of 1,000 letters had been sent in, many of them signed Jack the Ripper. So it became very popular for people to send in letters signed by Jack the Ripper. And you have records like Miriam, I've forgotten her surname now, but it was a Welsh housewife who was writing letters to her neighbour, said, I'm Jack the Ripper, I'm going to come into your room tonight and kill you. And the magistrates, when they found out who'd done it, they arrested them. There was a boy in Glasgow, for example, who was arrested for having written a Jack the Ripper letter, and he was arrested by the police and questioned by the police. And this Miriam, there was another lady, a servant girl in Torquay, who threatened her master, say, "I'm Jack the Ripper." So these letters were turning up, and whenever these, there was a girl in Bradford, perhaps the most famous one at the time was Maria Coroner in Bradford, who wrote a letter to the chief constable saying she was Jack the Ripper. It purported to come from Jack the Ripper, and she was actually taken to court. So when the magistrates got these people before them, they threw the book at them, because they said, it's you're because the other thing it did was, every one of the letters had to be investigated. So it overstretched the police even further, because they were suddenly getting all these hoaxers sending letters in. And everyone thought it was a huge joke. I mean, that was the point about when that name came into sight, when that name Jack the Ripper hit, it becomes almost a pantomime. And everyone's, there's people out at the side, there's people out at the scenes selling orange juice, selling ballads about Jack the Ripper, selling all sorts of things. There's waxworks on Whitechapel Road doing wax effigies of the victims at the time when the murders are taking place. So it almost became a figure of pantomime. And as you start to look at him as he then develops, when people start to describe him, he becomes a pantomime villain. So that's when you start to get the idea of the man in the top hat and the swirling cape, which probably wasn't certainly wasn't how he was dressed. But that image caught on because he became almost a pantomime villain.
That kind of leads me to my next question. Out of all obviously there was lots and lots of witnesses at that time, but out of all the witness testimonies, did they actually have a concrete kind of image for Jack, or was it like you've just said, the hearsay of the black hat, the cloak jacket thing?
Yeah, as far as we know about Jack, I mean, we've got two serious witnesses. We've got Israel Schwartz, who saw the attack on Elizabeth Stride. There's another man called Joseph Lavender, who walked past Mitre Square 15 minutes before the body of Catherine Eddowes was found, and he saw Catherine. He didn't see her face because she had her back to him, but when he was shown Catherine Eddowes' clothing in the mortuary, he was emphatic that was the clothing the woman he'd seen was wearing. And she was chatting with a man who did have his face to her, and he described the man as being in his early 30s, about 5'6" to 5'8", fresh complexion, fair hair, a fair moustache, and the overall appearance of a sailor. So that's Joseph Lavender. And the police seem to have taken his description quite seriously. There was another man called George Hutchinson who met Mary Kelly on Commercial Street in the early hours of the morning on which she was murdered, and he saw her approach a man. The man said something to her. They started laughing, and she led him into Dorset Street, where she lived in Miller's Court. Hutchinson followed, and he waited outside for 45 minutes. And nothing happened, so he went home. And the police, certainly Inspector Aberline, took his description very seriously as well. A lot of people today say that his description is just too good to be true. He just gives too much detail about the man who he said he saw in the dark. And a lot of people think that he was, that basically the reason he did it was because he'd certainly waited outside Miller's Court for 45 minutes, waiting for Mary Kelly to come out. And she didn't come out, so he went home. But of course, during that 45 minutes, he was seen by several people. And then he panicked and thought, well, hang on, they're going to think it's me. So he comes up with this description that's too good to be true, to take the suspicion away from him. But certainly Lavender's description, the police seem to have taken very seriously indeed. Gillian Daniels says, I think it was the Polish guy, which was now the question is which Polish guy. There were several Polish guys. One was George Chapman, who was Severin Klawowski, who was changed his name to George Chapman, and he was arrested. He poisoned several wives, and he was executed in the early 1900s. The other Polish guy, who I think probably is the one you're referring to, was Aaron Kuzminski, who now he was the favoured suspect of the two head detectives on the case, Robert Anderson, who I mentioned earlier, who in his memoirs wrote that undiscovered murders are rare in London and crimes known as the Jack the Ripper murders do not fall into this category. He then says, in saying he was a low-born Polish Jew living in the heart of the area, I am stating an ascertained fact. And when the one person ever gained a clear view of the face of the murderer was confronted with our suspect and hesitantly identified him but refused to testify. Anderson doesn't name him. He just says that there was a witness identification and that he was Polish Jew. Anderson, a copy of his memoirs went to Chief Inspector Swanson. Now, Swanson never gets any mention in the film. He very rarely gets featured in any of the films, but he was the man who was put in overall charge of assessing all the information in early September 1888. So he had the big picture. And in his copy of the memoirs, where Anderson says he was just a low-born Polish Jew, Swanson names him as Kosminski. That suggests it was Aaron Kosminski, because he's the only one who fits the bill. He says this Kosminski went into the asylum, and Aaron Kosminski is the only one who fits that bill. So I think that's the one you're referring to there, Gillian. And he has to be, because these two men were the highest ranking officers with direct responsibility for the case, he has to be high up on the list of suspects.
So do you think that the living conditions in 1888 had an impact on the murders?
Yeah, certainly, perhaps not the living conditions as such. I mean, certainly for the victims, because the victims, apart from Mary Kelly, were lodging in common lodging houses. You paid 4p for a single bed, 8p for a double bed. If you didn't have the money for the bed, you weren't allowed to stay. We know Mary Nichols didn't have the money for her bed. She was thrown out of the house in the early hours. Annie Chapman didn't have the money. She was thrown out. Catherine Eddowes didn't. She didn't have anywhere to go. So consequently, and with Annie Chapman's murder, the newspapers start to comment, that these women were murdered for the sake of 4p. And how can we have a society when women are going out into the night and being murdered because they don't have 4p to pay for a bed? What did impact on the murders was the fact that, and this was commented on the time, there was very little street lighting in the area. There were lots of dark passageways and dark alleyways. So that made it perfect for the killer to commit the murders. And then if he knew his way through the alleyways, he could escape through the darkness. So that's and one of the things that came out of the killings was that the alleyways, the area should be better lit.
So in your opinion, did the murders have an impact on how the police investigated and carried out their work going on?
They again, it's difficult to say, because certainly you can actually see as the police go through the investigation, they do start getting some understanding of sealing off crime scenes. Mary Nichols, as I say, the body was taken within an hour, washed away. Annie Chapman, the body is taken quite quickly, but Dr. George Bagster Phillips did carry out a minute crime scene investigation. Elizabeth Stride, not so much, although the yard was searched by the police, but there were a lot of people in the yard at the time, and they were sealed in. Catherine Eddowes was investigated by a different police force, the City of London Police. She was murdered in the City of London, and they did a minute crime scene investigation. They noted everything at the scene of that crime, right down to the fact that several broken buttons found alongside the body. So they certainly started to understand it. As for how crimes were carried out, I don't think the Ripon murders so much influenced how crimes were being investigated, but at the time, detection was starting to develop an awful lot, and so the way crime investigation was going was starting to change. And of course, then by the early 1900s, you get fingerprinting is coming in. It's been around. It's already around at the time of the crimes, but it's not an established piece of crime scene investigation. But then gradually throughout the 1890s, it starts to change.
So here's one last question for you before we end of tonight. There's Above Paranormal saying, ask Richard if he thinks any of the suspects were the killer.
Yeah. It's almost impossible to say. I think possibly. I think Aaron Kosminski is a good contender. There's another chap called Thomas Cutbush, who certainly was homicidal. He's in the asylum from 1891. He's in Broadmoor, actually, and he is very violent. He's always threatening to rip people apart. One occasion, his mother goes to visit him. She goes to kiss him goodbye, and he tries to bite her nose off. So he was certainly homicidal. He's an interest. Cutbush doesn't get that much mention as a suspect, but I think he deserves to be looked into more. But then again, my other theory, belief is that if the day comes when someone says, "Yep, we found out who Jack the Ripper was, and I'm going to name him tomorrow," and then we're all sitting around waiting for that name, the big unveiling or the naming ceremony, the curtain comes aside, and there's the name on the wall, and everyone goes, who the heck was that? So I think we'll never know. But I think Kosminski certainly should be up there high on the list of suspects, and I think Cutler should as well.
Cool. Well, on that note, it's been an amazing live, and we're definitely going to have to get you back on.
Thank you very much.
So I'm going to say bye to everybody.
Yeah, goodbye, everybody. Very nice meeting you all.
Yeah, thanks very much for coming in, guys, and for all your questions, your comments, everything. It's been fantastic, Richard. I'm just sitting here just listen. I can listen to you all night. You know, I'm just sitting here listening to you. If you would just hang on the panel, you know, just sit with you for a couple of minutes after we go up. But thanks to everybody for coming in. Hope you enjoy the rest of your evening and your morning. And take care and stay safe. And we'll be back on tomorrow night at 9 o'clock. So take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.